During the 1st century BC, we are given an account by a general in the Roman army of different events that occurred in what is now modern-day France. Back then, it was called Gaul. Now, Gaul was a particular province within the Roman Empire. It was at the edge of the Roman Empire, and it is where we encounter some of the groups that become famous during the medieval ages. Some of those groups are the Gauls themselves, though they would eventually become incorporated into the next group, who are the Germans. The Germans, or the Germanic tribes, as they were at that time, were a collection of different groups, and they spoke different languages, and they were migrating from the north around kind of Scandinavia, southern Scandinavia area, and they slowly came south. They came from the east, they kind of went around and they went into Gaul and would eventually become Italy, Spain, England, all the different areas. So today, I want to talk about some of the early writings that we have discussing them, who those writings are from, and what we can learn about them. Hi, my name is Brandon Foster, and this is the podcast Medieval Germanica. You can find me on this podcast, on Spotify, Substack, and many other places if you enjoy what you hear. Thanks. So, who was the individual, the general, that was in Gaul during the 1st century? Well, there was multiple, but the main one that we have writings from comes from Julius Caesar. Yes, the famous man himself. Before his untimely death and the whole drama that would take place in Rome itself, that we have dramatized by William Shakespeare, before all of that happened, he was in Gaul. That is where he was stationed. That is where he gained his fame, and the whole marching his army across the Rubicon, that all happened because of his time in Gaul. So his writings, which I have not finished reading part of the way through, and there's a specific section I want to discuss, but his writings are about the wars that he wages there. It's called the Commentary on the Gallic Wars, the book he wrote, at least that's what we call it today. And while he's there, he encounters lots of different groups. Now, one thing that I find very interesting, and as I teach history, this is something that I have to correct myself on going further, is that we always talk about these locations as if they were a singular area, or at least the people within it are a singular group. And that's never the case. When Julius Caesar is in Gaul, he talks about a lot of different groups. There's, of course, the Gauls themselves. They're one of the main Celtic groups that lived within Gaul. But he discusses 3 different groups that live within that territory that he was over. They were his allies, is how he talks about them. Now, one of the first problems that we have when reading primary sources like the Commentary on the Gallic Wars is that they're only from one perspective. And in this case, like many times, it is from the victor's point of view. We know very little about the Gauls from these writings. There's other ways of knowing. We have archaeology, we have other writings, and we have there's lots of whole collection that when put together, you get a decent picture. But when it comes from writings, especially from their point of view, there's virtually nothing. At least nothing that I know of. If you know of many other writings, please put down in the comments. I would love to read them. But when historians who primarily look at primary sources, documents written by people during the period, either eyewitnesses or from an eyewitness, there's very little. We don't have a lot in the written language department, as in they didn't have a written language or it was very primitive. The Germanic tribes, they used runes in some form, but they didn't use it to the same degree as the Romans and the Greeks, who had a very complex written language, and they had dozens and hundreds of books of varying types. The Germans didn't have that, neither did the Gauls. So we don't have much from their point of view. And that really frustrates historians, especially me, because when we're reading Julius Caesar's point of view, and he's talking about the Gauls throwing themselves at his feet to plead things, and they're giving him all these compliments and all these great things, we always have to take a pause and wonder how much of that is real, how much of that is true, because Julius Caesar would have had a massive ego. He was a very powerful, very famous general, and his soldiers, this part I do believe, they absolutely adored him. You don't dislike a general and then break some of your oldest laws within your nation or your culture. Crossing the Rubicon was a huge thing. That was a very big problem. That wasn't something you just lightly did. So his soldiers loved him. But when it's talking about the Gauls and the Belgae, which is another tribe, and the Helvetii, which is another tribe that he goes to war with, these groups that go around, it's always hard to know how much to believe. And that's one thing I'm always pondering and questioning when reading, and every good historian should, is this true? This is one thing that we have to always look at when reading. It can be considered like pseudo-history or side history. And that's a lot of where we get our kind of alternative interpretations of things, so conspiracy theories and such. To think of something from a different point of view is an amazing thing. That's something we should always do. But we should always be careful with how we evaluate those things. Sometimes the document that we're looking at to gain this alternative view is not a good document to look at all. Anyway, so go back to the whole story. So Julius Caesar comes to Gaul, and he is either there for a little bit or he's first arrived. He doesn't really say. He talks about himself in the third person, which is really weird. And he talks about it as if it is in the present, which is weird. He talks about somebody going and doing something, even though he wrote this, who knows how long after the events within his, like he wrote it himself. So it would be years later, but it's his recollection, but he's writing it in first person or third person present tense. It's really weird. So he arrives in Gaul, and there's this group that's starting to invade Gaul. And so this one group shows up, this one tribe, and we encounter 1 to 2 dozen tribes so far. And again, I'm not very far into commentary, but there's lots of different tribes. So again, Gaul is a very complex social structure. There's not just one group in charge, and it's a kingdom. It is a general geographical locale that the Romans had conquered mostly, allied the rest, and so there is all this interplay between the different tribes and the Romans. And so this one group, the Helvetii, they live across one of the rivers, and that's how Julius Caesar breaks up all the territory. He says that this one tribe lives across this river, the next river, this other tribe lives across the next river, a different tribe lives. And the main one for the Germans is the Rhine. So the Germans lived past the Rhine. That was one of the farthest sectors. They didn't go past that. Romans never conquered past the Rhine, as far as I'm aware. That was one of their boundaries. Same thing within England. They only got halfway across because it was just too far. They stretched themselves too thin. The tribes were just becoming, in their view, more and more barbaric, more and more brutal. You couldn't conquer that far because by the time you got there, your soldiers were too tired. You didn't have the resources to continue feeding them, and it was entirely different terrain and warfare, which is what the Romans were the best at doing. They were best at adapting militarily to fight any new enemies. But by the time they got to the Germans, they were already too thin. They couldn't go any further. So the Rhine was one of their boundaries. They didn't get much past that. So there's this battle going on, and he defeats the Helvetii. And then, shortly after that, this other group shows up. This is the one I want to spend the rest of the time quickly talking about. There's not a lot to talk about, but this is when the Germans step in. So we are introduced. I'm going to grab my wonderful tablet here and pull it up so I get the name right, because it is a unique German name that I've just now come in contact with. He is informed, Julius Caesar is, that there is an invasion going on by this Germanic tribe. And he gives a long list of different things that go on. And eventually he sends a diplomat to go talk to this guy. He's like, hey, I hear you're the king of the Germans. And as far as I know, this is the first king of the Germans we were ever told about in history. And again, unfortunately, it is from the point of view of Julius Caesar. And I wish that we had some of the more internal details from the German side. And this is the case for anything. When you have a society that didn't write things down, or if they did write things down, we've completely lost everything. It is so frustrating to not know what they were thinking and from their side. Because all we're told is that this king, his name is Ariovistus. Is that his actual name? Was that the German name? Or was that the Latinized pronunciation, or is that his Latin name? That's one thing I do not know. If we do know, I have not read about it. So, anyway, so we're introduced to this king, and we are told a few things about the Germans, but not much. We are told that they are courageous, warlike, and strong, and that they live across the Rhine. And that's about it. They lived in what would be Germany today. That was one of the main areas that the Germanic tribes settled, the big ones, and of course others would settle later. The largest tribe that would settle in the Rhine area was the Franks, and they were actually a confederacy of tribes. We'll talk about that in a different video. But the Franks were the main group that settled there. Then you had the Lombards who settled in Italy, the Visigoths settled in Spain, and then the Saxons and the Anglos would go settle in England. And there was this mass migration and across all these different areas. So Ariovistus was going to war with the Gauls, and Julius Caesar sends a diplomat again and asks him, do you mind stopping? And Ariovistus says, no, they provoked it, they caused it, and I'm going to finish what I came to do. Julius Caesar also asked if he would relinquish any captives. He said, no, I rightfully took these. They were given to me by the Gauls. So no, I'm not going to give up anything. You can't make me. Well, you can, but you have to come fight me. And one of the interesting things as their armies come together that I'm very intrigued in was the use of cavalry. Because in other sections, by the time we get to Tacitus, a century or so later, we are told that they don't do much with cavalry. And so I'm very intrigued, is that different tribes focus on either foot soldiers or cavalry? Because when they have their meeting between Ariovistus and Julius Caesar, they go to a hill, they get this large kind of plain with a nice little hill. And Ariovistus tells Caesar, you cannot bring foot soldiers. You have to bring only your cavalry, and only in certain sections. And Caesar said, that's fine. They go up there, they start talking, and Caesar claims that Ariovistus says, his cavalry, part of his cavalry, start going and bothering his soldiers. They start throwing things, whether weapons, rocks, stuff like that, harassing, and potentially, if they have the chance, killing someone, but they're harassing them. So Caesar says, this is futile. Let's end this. And then Ariovistus tries to meet him again, and Julius Caesar says, no, all you want to do is cause problems. And eventually they do go to war. Ariovistus loses, because at that time you didn't beat the Romans. So if the Romans went to the Germans, they probably would have lost. But if someone comes to the Romans, you are definitely going to lose. The Romans were at the beginning of their hype. This is right before the Roman Empire begins and all of that. And so it's a very interesting and very short story about this Germanic king. And he is called a king. Julius Caesar acknowledges that he is a king. And so that's another question. Was he a king in the way the Romans saw things as king? Or was he a chief? There's a lot of different things that we don't fully know, especially I don't fully know, about early Germanic culture. They didn't necessarily have kings, but did they? We don't know. Based off of Nordic culture, which we know much more about because their culture was more preserved and they had more writings centuries later. We know that they had chiefs and that chiefs could gather together and there could be a king of the chiefs. And there's lots of different things that could happen. And I don't know it all very clearly. It's not what I studied. And so it's very interesting when he calls him king, because again, we don't have from Ariovistus' point of view. He might have said something different. And I'm not a king, I'm a chief, or I'm a warlord. We're not 100% sure. But we do know that the Romans considered him a king. We know he went to war with Julius Caesar. We know he lost. He fled across back to the Rhine, and that's the last that we have heard of him in this saga. Now, in the next book, Julius Caesar is going to war with other people, and I haven't gotten much through that section. But I thought it was a very interesting story about this first king that I've ever heard about, or the oldest king that I've ever heard about, that was a German. And I wanted to share that with y'all. If you have any questions about Ariovistus, about ancient Germans, or really any primary sources or the commentary on the Gallic Wars, please leave them below. If you enjoy what you heard, please like, share, comment anything else. Do all the different stuff. The internet's been around forever, you know. And thank you for listening. I really appreciate it.